and let's go to the question of philosophy behind geopolitics. So perhaps what are your initial thoughts on this?
Well, I would say that geopolitics, it's not really a subject about which I have a lot of opinions or a lot of ideas necessarily. Because the thing about geopolitics is that it seems very contingent upon historical circumstances, different social circumstances, economic circumstances, which make it, which contribute to developing a certain condition in which different countries in different parts of the world are placed. They're placed in such circumstances. For instance, well, now we see that Russia is in such a state, and we see that the United States is in such a state, etc., because of many different contingencies throughout history, economic development, historical things like wars and peace treaties, and different economic systems. All these things play into creating this geopolitical atmosphere that we have today. So I suppose that would perhaps be more of an historical or economic or political point of view rather than a philosophical point of view. Though one could make deep, you could say, philosophical judgments about, well, what is, for instance, Russia all about? What is its ideological basis? What is the relation between Western civilization and the Russian society, or China, or other places? What is the relationship between Russia and the Middle East and the Islamic countries of the world? Many issues that can be discussed on a very deep level, but again, I think many of these things are based upon contingencies, which seems to be more in the realm of history, economics, political science than philosophy. Though I would be interested in hearing people's thought about, well, what can we say about Western civilization in contradistinction to, say, Russia or China? That would be interesting, but yeah, those would be my initial thoughts. What do you think?
Yes, I think it's an interesting question, and I guess I would have agreed with your statement perhaps 2 years ago, but now I actually think that there are some philosophical, how do you say, that philosophy plays an important role in this, and you have mentioned the way that it plays an important role in this, which is the ideological basis of different societies. And there is an author named Arnold J. Toynbee who has written a book, A Study of History. And this is, I think, an absolutely fantastic book. And in this book, he deals with the question of the rise and fall of civilizations. And he roughly defines a civilization as all the societies, either locally or over time, spread throughout human history, that have the same philosophical core or the same ideological core. And so, for example, he calls Western Christendom one civilization, or he calls the Islamic nations one civilization, or he calls the Hellenistic civilization, which one consists of all the Greek and Roman states. Or there would be different different civilizations also in the Far East and also around India. Egypt would have been a civilization, and also a couple of civilizations in South America. And so I guess, and his point is that a civilization is healthy as long as its this ideal or this religion, basically, which is at its core, is healthy and is up to date and being actualized in reality. And when a society loses its core, then it starts to decay and eventually dies, or a civilization, I should have to say. And so I guess there is an important aspect of the average morality of the population of a society would determine, in my view, the trajectory that this society is on. So if many people in a society truly try to be good human beings, then there is a high chance, at least, that this society will improve and become better and richer and larger and more beautiful. And also, if many people adhere to or do evil things and just try to increase their own profit by any means possible, then this society would start to decay. And I guess, globally speaking, we see a lot of societies or people trying to improve their own material state by any means possible. And I guess that would lead to the state of the world that we see at the moment. So I guess these would be my initial thoughts.
Interesting. Perhaps then one could say that philosophy, one of the areas in philosophy, is reflecting upon the nature of society. What is a society made of? What is its basic structure? Political philosophy, obviously, about the nature of government and talking about different forms of government, etc. And when one sort of philosophizes about that and discovers truths about what would be a healthy society, what would be the natural tendencies of that society, etc., then you could talk about different geopolitical scenarios as applications of those truths. You could say, well, we see that Russia is in a state it is because of this and this and this and this, and that is an application of the nature of society. The nature of society is such that when this happens and this happens, it will lead to this. When this happens, it will lead to this, and this is precisely what we have seen with Russia. Therefore, there is this link in that way. And also the opposite way, that we see the geopolitical structure or scenario around the world, and that can give us information into what is the social fabric of society, what is the nature or natural tendencies of societies or human beings or governments. So that can help us gain knowledge into the structure of society itself. Because one thing to note about knowledge, generally speaking, is you could say that we are sort of deriving universals from particulars. We look at the world around us and we see many different things with our senses. And we see particular concrete things, but then by means of having knowledge about these particular concrete things, we discover deeper truths about the nature of the different, of a specific category of things, class of things. We see many trees, and thus we can make judgments about what is the tree essentially. We see many human beings, and we can make judgments about, well, what is human nature? We see many societies, and thus we can make judgments about society, etc. So I think this hierarchical development of our access to reality, that by means of more direct, sensible truths, like seeing things with our five senses, we receive deeper, more universal knowledge. I think this goes all the way back to Plato, perhaps even earlier, that is Plato. And that could be said of geopolitics as well. It's a direct way in which we could perhaps reach deeper knowledge. What do you think about that?
Yes, very interesting points that you made there. Yeah, I guess I would agree that society reflects the philosophy that the members of this society hold. Like the state of a society reflects the philosophy that these people live by. And so if you think about what would be a healthy society, or what would be true or correct principles by which a society should be organized, or that it should adhere to in its action, then this adhering to these true principles would lead to being in a better state, whereas adhering to false principles would lead to being in a worse state. And of course, when you formulate like this, it sounds like self-evident that if you build a society on false moral principles, then it will not work very well. And if you build it on true principles, it will work better. And this then radiates outwards. And of course, the same goes for interacting with another society. So there would be true principles of interaction between societies, like if you make a treaty, then you should hold your word, and then you will gain more respect or more credibility with other societies, and they will be more willing to trust you. Whereas if you violate your word as a society, then they won't trust you in the future. And so I think these kinds of things are very important and are what I meant. And of course also your statement that that knowledge means deriving universals from particulars, I think is a very well put observation and very important. And in that sense, we can derive perhaps certain principles about how societies should behave by looking at the geopolitical landscape and seeing how things went for different societies who behaved in different ways.
Interesting observations. Right, and one could say that, well, there are general philosophical judgments about the relation between governments. For instance, two governments which think more alike will have a higher inclination of being friends rather than foes. Perhaps that's an example of how one could, I suppose, present philosophical truths, which would be very relevant to geopolitical analysis. By the way, we also have a new commentary by St. Augustine, or Augustine, 560 ZX. I can just read it very quickly. Is it immoral to want a minimum material/economic living standard? It seems easy as a Westerner to suggest wanting more, quote, materialism is immoral. Did you want to comment about the geopolitical issue, or just go and comment on this comment here?
Yeah, I might address this comment specific. Of course, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that people shouldn't desire to have a minimum or even an improved economic/material living standard. What I was talking about is the means that people think are acceptable or proper to reach this goal. Because people in a certain society might, by and large, think I would want this society to function better, and I would want my material standard to be higher. Therefore, I will get up in the morning and work harder and try to cooperate with my other fellow citizens as best as I can in order to improve things. Or they could say, well, I just have to be part of the small group that is in power so that I can exploit all the rest of my members of my society so that I will have a high material/economic living standard. And the first approach, which I believe to be objectively good and moral, will, if enough people in this society choose it, will lead to a better state of this society. Whereas if enough people in this society choose the second approach and try to get rich at the expense of their neighbor, then the society will devolve more and more or remain poor.
Interesting observations. Also, first I was a little bit unsure about whether that comment was a suggestion to a new topic, but it seems like it was more a comment on what you said about societies and civilizations. Right, yes, so perhaps one could add that a good society or a strong society is one in which people would be willing to make sacrifices for the overall improvement of that society, whether materially or culturally or spiritually. So sacrifice is an important part in building up a good society. So
yeah, that reminds me of an interesting thought that is also particularly inspired by Jordan Peterson, but I think I kind of pulled it a little bit further, that actually the right mode of being, of interacting with the world, is to make sacrifices yourself in order to improve the world. And I guess that the opposite approach would be to sacrifice other people or to sacrifice the world in order to improve the state of yourself. And so when you see evil people, they typically want to sacrifice someone else's well-being and happiness or material possession in order that they themselves have more. Whereas when you see people who we conceive as being moral actors, then they would typically make sacrifices themselves in order to improve their own state or the state of the world around them.
Yes, interesting points. Yeah, and this concern is the fundamental principles of what distinguishes a good or strong society versus a bad society. This willingness to make sacrifices for the betterment of society as a whole, etc. And also I would refer briefly to this approach which I've argued for previously, that when we look to what does a good society consist of, we should thinking of trying to conform that society to a specific kind of natural order, an order which would fulfill the human nature and human natural needs of all its members. Similar to how when you have a sick body, the primary goal should be to restore that body to a healthy natural state, which is ordered. Similar to a society, if you have a bad or sick society, you should try to restore it or change it into conforming to some natural order. So I believe very much in that principle. And that natural order would involve a good family structures, a good culture, and of course I would add the true religion as well, and different spiritual values connected to that, virtues, and also economically, that there should be this natural structure of economics. There should be a significant element of decentralization. There should be a natural balance between bureaucracy and people having their own individual independent means to sustenance, etc. So I believe very much in this principle of a natural order to which society should conform. And that's another problem, I would say, with many of the modern political approaches, that it's very much about, well, let's look at GDP, let's look at all these statistics, and let's look at, okay, well, how can we increase this unit, and how can we deal with this mathematical, statistical variation, and that's very misleading. That's not what society is about. It's about conforming to a natural order, not simply increasing, producing this amount of things or this amount of, or this income and production and all these different statistics are not really the essence of society. You could say they are effects of different things or aspects of different things, but not the natural order itself. So I think much of modern political discourse is very flawed because they don't have the right approach. And that could also be applicable to geopolitics. That's when people are talking about, well, how should geopolitics be? We need to have the right approach about, okay, what is the natural order to which different countries should be organized, in what state, and of course also what should be the relation between different governments in a natural state. You could perhaps say that, well, this philosophy of Machiavelli, that the government should only think about its own interest rather than trying to conform to some ideal. I think that's very much flawed. I think that's a huge problem to think in this way. We should try to think about, okay, to the degree it's possible and practical and feasible, you should try to have relations between governments which would promote the natural order and well-being of societies.
Yeah, very good point. Both of them, I guess. The first one is more about society itself, And I would very much agree that there is a sort of human nature, that human beings have a certain nature, and by this nature certain things are good for them and allow them to flourish, and other things are bad for them and hinder them from flourishing. And a good society should have internally a structure that allows all of its members to fulfill these needs that come from their human nature and to live according with their human nature. And I also particularly liked your second point, that we should apply this principle then to geopolitics or international relations as well. This seems to be a big problem today, that most countries, and not only the governments but also the people within these countries, the population, they seem to think that, yeah, well, we just want to enhance our own desires at the expense of other countries because we don't really give a shit about them. And that's not an approach that will lead to a good interaction with another entity if you don't care at all about their needs and their desires. And so I guess if people came into the habit of, and governments then by representing the people, to deal with different governments or with other societies in a way that should be for the mutual benefit of both parties, instead of trying to force your own will onto the other and extract something from them against their will. But you should say, no, we need to interact in a way that we can have a society where our members can fulfill their natural needs, and at the same time you as another society should have the same possibility as well. Then I guess that would lead to different interactions, indeed, yes.
Right, and also that you should promote peace between nations, and also that, yes, even though you have countries which do not conform to the natural law in very notorious and grave ways, you should still try to think about, well, still, insofar as we're talking about our country's relation to that country, we should have peace and harmony. So I oppose very much this idea of, for instance, the United States government or military being the world police. I don't think that's natural or good. So, yes, such principles, but we have these ideals we should conform to, and not trying to think in these Machiavellian terms of, well, what can we get out of it? How can we increase this and that? How can we exploit this and that? Now try to think of the overall health and moral condition of your society. That is what you need to think about. So that should be the approach, I would say, to that. Right, so I'm not sure if I have very much more to add about that subject, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would have one addition to what you have said, and to which I agree. But I guess wanting to promote peace doesn't mean that you are never willing to engage in war. There might be reasons or situations, there might be situations in which it's unavoidable. And if someone wants to bully you, if that's another country that wants to bully you, then you have to resist. You shouldn't, it's not the appeasement politics idea. It's very dangerous and it doesn't work. So that's not, I guess, what we are saying here. But I guess the important thing would be that you, as a country, have good intentions, truly good intentions when you are dealing with other countries. It's like this idea, there's this very difficult idea in Christianity that you should pray for your enemies. And I guess it has something to do with this, that you shouldn't just want that which is good for yourself, but you should also want that which is good for the other party with which you are interacting, even if this party is hostile to you at the moment. Because if you have really good intentions, then I guess over the long run, this will lead to a better state of society and also of international relations than if you have actually bad intentions and the intention of really exploiting another country, because that will lead to very different behavior, even in war and even in conflict. And so I guess that's the important point.
Right, yes, there is this philosophical tradition called the just war theory, promoted by Christian philosophers like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, talking about the conditions which have to be in place in order to justify war, because in certain cases war can't be justified if it's the last resort, etc. to many things, and those are relevant to think about. And yes, to the principle about willing the good of others, not yourself only. Yeah, I think that's a very good. It's true and good principle, and it's something that is central to Christianity, and I think that would also impact significantly countries' approach to other countries, because they think that, well, these people in that country, they're also made in the image and likeness of God. They are valuable human beings. We have to take that into account. So yeah, I think that's also important.